In a quiet diner on a seemingly ordinary night, a blind man finds himself at the center of a life-changing moment. A blind man faces two desperate criminals, risking everything to stop a robbery. His words spark an unbelievable chain of events no one saw coming. Before we get into this unforgettable story, make sure you're subscribed to Epic Story Moments. Don't forget to hit that bell so you never miss another amazing tale. If you enjoy the story, like, share, and leave a comment. It helps us bring more heartwarming stories your way. And we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Let's stay connected. Marcus Davis lived in a quaint, tightly knit neighborhood where every corner held memories. Despite being blind, Marcus carried himself with a confidence that inspired everyone who crossed his path. He worked as a piano tuner, his skilled hands and keen ears weaving harmony into the lives of those he served. His presence was a cornerstone of the community, where people admired his wisdom, resilience, and unwavering sense of justice. At the heart of this neighborhood stood a modest diner, a pawn shop with faded signage, and a community center that served as a gathering place for locals. Marcus's daily routine revolved around these spots. He was a familiar figure, tapping his cane rhythmically along the sidewalks, his other hand often trailing the walls of buildings as he expertly navigated the streets. The locals greeted him warmly, their voices lighting his path as he returned their kindness tenfold. Lila Harper worked at the diner, where Marcus often spent his evenings. A kind-hearted waitress with a perpetual smile, Lila was battling her own insecurities. She admired Marcus for his ability to face the world without sight, yet with unmatched clarity. Their bond was one of quiet understanding. Lila often helped Marcus carry his meal to his usual booth, and in return, he offered words of encouragement that often seemed to speak directly to her hidden struggles. The quiet streets, however, hid shadows darker than most realized. Bryce and Tyler, two young men burdened by life's harshness, lingered on the outskirts of the community. Bryce, desperate to escape crushing debt, found himself entangled in a plan he didn't fully believe in. Tyler, fueled by simmering anger and prejudice, was the driving force. His bitterness stemmed from a troubled past, though few could see past his hard exterior. The two formed a volatile pair, each with motives that hinted at an impending storm. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the streets were bathed in a soft amber glow. Marcus sat at the diner counter, enjoying the comforting murmur of conversation around him. Lila poured him a cup of coffee, her voice brightening as she updated him on her day. It was a scene of ordinary beauty, yet there was a subtle unease in the air, a tension that only Marcus seemed to perceive. With his heightened senses, he noted the hushed tones and quickened steps of passers-by outside. Something was amiss, though the cause remained veiled in the gathering dusk. Bryce paced the small, cluttered apartment he shared with Tyler, his heart racing as the weight of his debts bore down on him. Bills and final notices were scattered across the table, mocking him with their red-lettered urgency. He had tried everything, extra shifts, odd jobs, even borrowing from friends, but nothing was enough. Now, the whispers of a desperate plan echoed in his mind, drowning out reason. Tyler, leaning against the doorframe with a smirk, watched Bryce with calculating eyes. "You don't have a choice," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You either sink or you fight back. And I'm not talking about working your way out like some idiot." Tyler's idea of fighting back was simple. Take what they needed and leave fear in their wake. Bryce hesitated, his stomach twisting at the thought. "It's not just about me," he murmured. "People could get hurt." Tyler rolled his eyes. "You think anyone cares about us? Look around, Bryce. No one's coming to save you. You either do this, or you're done." Bryce's reluctance hung heavy in the air, but the desperation in his chest was louder. As Tyler laid out the plan, Bryce tried to ignore the growing pit in his stomach. The target, the neighborhood diner. It wasn't flashy, but it was steady, with a till full of cash at the end of the night. Tyler assured him it would be quick. Get in, grab the money, and disappear. What Bryce didn't know was that Tyler's motives went beyond money. For Tyler, this was about power, about asserting control over a world that had always treated him as less than. His anger festered beneath the surface, spilling into pointed remarks and venomous jokes. His sneering comments about the people who frequented the diner, particularly Marcus, revealed a deep-rooted prejudice that Bryce found unsettling. The night they chose was quiet, with most of the neighborhood winding down after a long day. Marcus was at his usual booth, sipping coffee and chatting softly with Lila. The warm light inside the diner contrasted with the cold, dark streets outside, where Bryce and Tyler waited in a beat-up car, their breath fogging the windows. Bryce clutched the steering wheel, his hands trembling. "You're hesitating again," Tyler snapped, his tone sharp. "You're gonna blow this before we even start." Bryce started, but Tyler cut him off. "You just nothing. Stick to the plan, and we'll be out before anyone knows what's happening." As Bryce nodded reluctantly, Marcus, inside the diner, felt a strange unease. It wasn't the first time he'd sensed something off lately. Rumors of increasing crime had been circulating for weeks, and the subtle shifts in the neighborhood's rhythm hadn't escaped him. He couldn't see the two men outside, but he felt the weight of their presence, like a storm brewing just beyond the horizon. Lila noticed his furrowed brow. "You okay, Marcus?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. Marcus tilted his head, as if listening to something beyond her words. "Just a feeling," he said quietly, like the air's holding its breath. Outside, Bryce and Tyler slipped on their masks, the moment of decision upon them. Bryce's hands shook as he adjusted his mind screaming at him to stop. Tyler, however, was already out of the car, his movements purposeful and unyielding. "Let's go," Tyler hissed, and Bryce had no choice but to follow. As the bell above the diner door jingled, the warm, familiar atmosphere was shattered. All eyes turned to the masked figures standing in the entrance, their presence like a crack in the foundation of a once-safe haven. Bryce felt every gaze, every heartbeat, while Tyler thrived on the fear he saw blooming around him. Marcus's head turned slightly, his senses sharpening as he processed the intruders. Lila froze behind the counter, her eyes wide with shock. For a moment, time seemed to pause, the weight of the situation pressing down on everyone in the room. Tyler raised his voice, barking orders and demanding cash. Bryce stood behind him, his feet feeling like lead. As Tyler's threats grew sharper, Bryce's internal conflict reached a boiling point. He didn't want this. Not like this. Marcus remained calm, his voice steady as he addressed the robbers. "You don't have to do this," he said, his words cutting through the chaos like a blade. His composure caught Bryce off guard, while Tyler's anger flared at the unexpected resistance. "Shut up, old man," Tyler snapped. But there was a crack in his voice, a hint of something Marcus noticed immediately. The tension in the diner was palpable, every second stretching into an eternity. Marcus knew the storm had arrived, and it was about to test them all. The air in the diner was thick with the comforting aroma of fresh coffee and the faint hum of chatter from the regulars. Marcus sat in his usual corner booth, savoring the warmth of the evening. Lila approached with a gentle smile, setting down his favorite dish, her presence as familiar as the rhythm of his days. "Everything okay today, Marcus?" she asked, her voice tinged with genuine care. Marcus nodded, the corner of his mouth lifting in a small smile. "As fine as it gets, Lila. You've been practicing kindness again, haven't you?" She chuckled lightly. "Maybe a little. It's hard not to when you're around." The bell above the diner's door jingled, drawing a fleeting glance from Lila before she returned to tidying the counter. To Marcus, the sound wasn't just a bell. It was a signal. The way it resonated, the sharp intake of breath that followed, and the sudden unnatural hush in the diner told him something was wrong. Two masked figures stood in the doorway, their presence disrupting the peaceful bubble of the diner. Tyler led the way, his posture tense and commanding, a handgun clutched in his gloved hand. Behind him, Bryce hesitated, his movements jittery as if his body was at war with his mind. "Everyone, hands where I can see them," Tyler barked, his voice cutting through the startled murmurs of the patrons. Panic rippled through the room, chairs screeching against the floor as people scrambled to comply. Marcus remained still, his head tilting slightly as he tuned into the chaos. The sharpness in Tyler's voice, the uneven breaths from Bryce, the hurried whispers of frightened patrons. Each detail painted a vivid picture in Marcus's mind. Lila froze behind the counter, her hands trembling as she reached for the cash register. Her eyes darted to Marcus, her fear evident. Marcus turned his head slightly toward her, his calm presence silently reassuring her to stay composed. Tyler stalked toward the counter, waving his weapon in a show of dominance. "Open it! Now!" he barked at Lila, who fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking. Meanwhile, Bryce hovered near the door, his body rigid as his gaze darted nervously around the room. His mask couldn't hide the conflict in his eyes, the internal battle raging between fear and regret. Marcus broke the silence, his voice calm and steady. "This isn't the way," he said, addressing the masked men. His tone carried no fear, only a quiet authority that demanded attention. Tyler's head snapped toward Marcus, his grip on the weapon tightening. "Did I ask for your opinion, old man?" he snarled, his anger barely masking the unease Marcus's composure stirred in him. Marcus tilted his head, as if scrutinizing Tyler despite his blindness. "You sound young," he said softly. "Too young to throw your life away like this." Bryce shifted uncomfortably, the weight of Marcus's words settling over him. Tyler, however, bristled with anger. He took a step closer to Marcus, his weapon now pointed directly at him. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Tyler growled. "Keep talking, and you'll find out how wrong you are." The patrons held their breath, the tension in the room thick enough to cut. Even Lila, frozen behind the counter, couldn't tear her eyes away from the standoff. Marcus didn't flinch. "No hero here," he said evenly. "Just a man who's seen enough to know this won't end well for you. Or him." He nodded slightly in Bryce's direction, his words striking a nerve in the younger man. Bryce's hand wavered, his breathing ragged as he glanced at Tyler, then back at Marcus. For a moment, it seemed like he might put the gun down, the weight of his choices visible in his trembling stance. Tyler, sensing Bryce's hesitation, turned on him. "Don't you dare back out now," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "We're in this together." As Marcus remained calm, his unyielding presence began to unravel the fragile threads holding Tyler together. His anger boiled over, and he turned the gun back toward Marcus, his hand shaking as he barked, "One more word, and I swear." The scene froze in time. Every eye in the diner locked on the blind man who refused to cower. The screen seemed to hold its breath, the camera lingering on the tension in Tyler's shaking hand, Bryce's wavering resolve, and the unflinching calm in Marcus's expression. The screen fades to black, leaving the fate of the diner hanging in a shroud of unbearable suspense. The once peaceful diner was now a battleground of tension and fear. Tyler's aggressive energy dominated the room as he shouted commands, waving his weapon menacingly. His anger seemed to fill every corner, suffocating the frightened patrons who sat frozen in their seats. Meanwhile, Bryce lingered near the door, his movements hesitant and his eyes darting nervously between Tyler, the terrified customers, and Marcus, who remained calm and unmoving. "Let's go." Tyler snapped at Bryce, gesturing toward the cash register. "Stop standing there like an idiot and help me out." Bryce flinched but didn't move. His heart pounded as he took in the scene before him. Lila's trembling hands, the wide-eyed fear of the diners, and Marcus's calm yet unyielding demeanor. This wasn't what he had imagined. He had thought they could get in, take the money, and leave without anyone getting hurt. But now, he realized Tyler was spiraling out of control, and the situation was far from under their control. Marcus's voice broke through the chaos, steady and composed. "You don't want to do this," he said, addressing Bryce directly. "I can hear it in your breathing, in the way you're hesitating. This isn't who you are." Bryce stiffened, his eyes locking onto Marcus as though the blind man could see straight through him. For a moment, the room seemed to shrink, leaving only the two of them. Marcus's words struck something deep within Bryce, stirring emotions he had buried under layers of fear and desperation. "Shut up," Tyler barked, turning his gun toward Marcus. "Stop messing with his head." But Marcus didn't flinch. "He's not messing with me," Bryce muttered under his breath, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Tyler whipped around to face Bryce, his face twisted with disbelief and anger. "What did you just say?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Bryce faltered, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't right, Tyler. This wasn't the plan." Tyler's fury ignited. The plan? The plan was to get the money and get out. "You think we can back out now? Do you want to end up in jail? Or worse?" As Tyler's rage boiled over, he turned his attention to Lila, who stood frozen behind the counter. He raised his gun, pointing it at her with a sneer. "Maybe this will remind you who's in charge here." Lila's breath hitched, and she stumbled back against the wall, her eyes wide with terror. The sight of her fear sent a jolt through Bryce, shaking him to his core. This wasn't what he had wanted. This wasn't what he had signed up for. "No!" Bryce shouted, stepping forward instinctively. His voice wavered, but it was loud enough to catch everyone's attention. "Leave her alone, Tyler. She hasn't done anything." Tyler turned to Bryce, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. "What's wrong with you?" he snapped. "You're really going to start acting like a hero now? After everything we've been through?" Bryce swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he looked Tyler in the eye. "This isn't who we are," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. "At least, it's not who I want to be." The tension in the diner reached a breaking point. Tyler's anger was a storm threatening to consume everyone in its path, while Bryce's internal struggle became a visible battle of conscience. The patrons watched in silence, their fear mingling with a flicker of hope as they saw cracks forming in the robbers' partnership. Marcus spoke again, his voice calm yet commanding. "You don't have to follow him," he said to Bryce. "You have a choice. You can stop this right now." Bryce's breathing quickened as Marcus's words seeped into his mind. For the first time, he realized he wasn't trapped. He could choose. He could change the course of the night, even if it meant facing the consequences of his actions. But Tyler wasn't about to let that happen. His grip on the gun tightened as he took a step toward Bryce, his voice low and venomous. "Don't even think about it," he warned. "You turn on me, and you'll regret it." The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension so thick it was almost tangible. Bryce stood frozen, torn between his loyalty to Tyler and the overwhelming urge to do what was right. Lila's terrified gaze and Marcus's steady calm anchored him in the moment, forcing him to confront the person he wanted to be. As Tyler's anger boiled over, the diner teetered on the edge of chaos, every second stretching into an eternity. The storm inside Bryce grew fiercer, threatening to break at any moment. The question lingered in the air, heavy with suspense. Would he stand up to Tyler, or would fear keep him bound to a path of destruction? Amid the tension in the diner, Marcus's calm voice cut through the silence like a lifeline. He turned his head slightly, addressing Bryce with a tone that carried both strength and understanding. "You remind me of someone I used to know," he began, his words deliberate and weighted with meaning. Bryce blinked, his trembling hands slowly lowering as his attention shifted fully to Marcus. Even Tyler, though still brimming with anger, hesitated, drawn in by the quiet power of Marcus's voice. Marcus continued, his words painting vivid images of a time long past. "When I was a young man, not much older than you, I found myself in a situation where I had to make a choice. I was angry at the world, angry at the way I was treated because of my skin, my blindness, angry at everything." The diner seemed to lean in, the other patrons momentarily forgetting their fear as they became absorbed in Marcus's story. Even Lila, standing frozen behind the counter, found herself captivated. There was a man back then, "A lot like Tyler," Marcus said, his voice softening. "He told me that the world owed him something, that the only way to survive was to take what you wanted. I listened to him for a while, followed him even, but then he paused, his sightless eyes seeming to search for something distant. Then I realized that every choice we make shapes who we are, and I didn't want to be shaped by anger and fear. I wanted to be something better." Bryce's chest rose and fell rapidly as he absorbed Marcus's words. The raw honesty in the man's story stirred something deep within him, making him question his own choices and the path that had led him here. Lila, sensing an opening, stepped out from behind the counter, her hands raised slightly in a gesture of peace. "Bryce," she said softly, her voice trembling but resolute, "you don't have to do this. I know what it feels like to think you've run out of options, to feel like there's no way out. But there is. There's always a way out." Bryce turned to her, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperation. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. "I don't have a choice. If I don't do this, I'm done for." Lila shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. "That's not true," she insisted. "Marcus is right. You always have a choice. You just have to be brave enough to make it." Meanwhile, Tyler's grip on his gun tightened as he watched the scene unfold. A flicker of something, uncertainty perhaps, crossed his face, but it was quickly replaced by anger. "Don't listen to them," he snapped at Bryce, his voice sharp and commanding. "They're just trying to mess with your head. You think they care about you? They don't even know you." Marcus turned his head slightly toward Tyler, his voice taking on a note of quiet compassion. "And what about you, Tyler?" he asked. "What made you so angry at the world? Who hurt you so badly that you think this is the only way to survive?" For a moment, Tyler faltered. His jaw tightened, and his gaze hardened, but there was a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes that betrayed him. "You don't know anything about me," he spat, though his voice lacked the conviction it had held moments earlier. "I don't," Marcus admitted, "but I can hear it in your voice. The pain, the mistrust. It's there, buried deep, but it's there." Bryce glanced at Tyler, his expression a mixture of sympathy and confusion. For the first time, he saw something in his partner that he hadn't noticed before. A vulnerability that made Tyler seem less like the invincible force he had always appeared to be and more like a man carrying a heavy burden. The room was silent, the weight of Marcus's story and Lila's pleas settling over everyone like a heavy fog. Bryce looked back at Marcus, his voice barely audible as he asked, "How did you do it? How did you walk away?" Marcus's lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile. "I chose to believe in something better," he said simply. "And I had people who believed in me, even when I couldn't believe in myself. You've got that too, Bryce. You just have to trust it." As Bryce stood there, teetering on the edge of a decision, the threads of their stories intertwined. Marcus's past, Lila's courage, Bryce's inner turmoil, and even Tyler's hidden pain. The air was thick with unspoken emotions, every moment brimming with the possibility of redemption or ruin. The diner was thick with silence, broken only by the shallow breathing of those caught in the crossfire of an emotional storm. Marcus's calm presence, Lila's pleas, and Bryce's visible turmoil created a fragile balance, as though the entire room teetered on the edge of a knife. Bryce's hand trembled as he lowered his weapon. His heart raced and his voice wavered. "You're right," he said, almost in a whisper. "This isn't who I want to be." A glimmer of hope flickered in Lila's tear-streaked eyes, and even Marcus's composed expression seemed to soften. "That's it," Marcus said, his voice steady and reassuring. "You've already taken the first step, Bryce. It's not too late." But the moment of calm was shattered by Tyler's voice, sharp and venomous. "What are you doing?" he barked, his grip on the gun tightening. His face was a mask of fury, and his eyes burned with betrayal. Bryce turned to him, his voice trembling but resolute. "I can't do this anymore, Tyler. It's over. Over." Tyler's laugh was cold and bitter. "You think you can just walk away? After everything I've done for you, you're nothing without me. Bryce flinched but stood his ground. You didn't do anything for me, he shot back, his voice gaining strength. You dragged me into this, made me believe I didn't have a choice. But I do, and I'm choosing to stop. Tyler's face twisted with rage. You ungrateful little. He didn't finish a sentence. Instead, he lunged at Bryce, his weapon raised. The room erupted into chaos. Patrons ducked for cover. Chairs scraped against the floor, and voices cried out in panic. Bryce stumbled backward, his hands raised in a defensive gesture. Tyler, stop, he shouted, but Tyler was beyond reason. In the chaos, Marcus stood up, his cane in one hand, the other outstretched as though he could physically stop the violence. Tyler, he called out, his voice commanding and filled with urgency. This isn't the way. It doesn't have to end like this. But Tyler wasn't listening. His focus was on Bryce, his movements erratic and fueled by a dangerous mix of anger and desperation. Then it happened. A scuffle, a struggle, and a deafening gunshot that echoed through the diner like a thunderclap. Time seemed to slow. The noise faded into a ringing silence, and the air grew heavy with dread. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. All eyes were on the scene in front of them, trying to piece together what had just happened. Bryce stood frozen, his hands shaking violently. Tyler was still, his expression one of stunned disbelief. The gun, which had moments ago been the source of so much fear, now lay on the floor, spinning slightly before coming to a halt. Then the screen began to fade. The scene blurred into darkness, leaving only the echo of the gunshot and the sound of someone's labored breathing. The audience was left in stunned silence, the fate of the characters hanging in the balance, the question lingering heavily in their minds. Who had been hit, and what would happen next? The ringing silence after the gunshot was broken by a sharp, pained gasp. Marcus, standing steady despite the chaos, slowly lowered himself into a chair. Blood seeped through his sleeve where the bullet had grazed his arm, but his expression remained calm, almost serene. Marcus, Lila cried out, rushing to his side. Her hands trembled as she tried to examine the wound. You're hurt. It's nothing, Marcus assured her, his voice steady despite the pain. I'm fine, Lila. Focus on keeping everyone safe. The sight of Marcus, calm and composed even as blood dripped onto the floor, had a profound effect on everyone in the room. Bryce stared at him, his face pale and stricken. I didn't mean for this to happen, he stammered, dropping the weapon he'd wrestled from Tyler. It clattered to the floor, a sound that seemed to echo the weight of his regret. Tyler, still reeling from the scuffle, stood frozen. His face was a storm of emotions, anger, confusion, and a flicker of fear. For the first time, he seemed to realize the gravity of what they had done. Bryce turned to him, his voice trembling but firm. It's over, Tyler. This needs to stop now. Tyler's eyes darted around the room, taking in the terrified faces of the patrons, the blood on Marcus's sleeve, and Bryce standing before him, no longer the uncertain follower he'd been moments ago. His fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't move. You don't get it, do you? Tyler hissed, his voice barely audible. They'll never forgive us for this. Never. They might not, Bryce admitted, his voice filled with a mix of sorrow and determination. But that doesn't mean we have to keep going down this path. We can still make it right. Marcus, despite his injury, spoke up, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had lived through countless storms. Bryce is right, he said. It's never too late to make a different choice. The first step is the hardest, but it's also the most important. Tyler's gaze flickered to Marcus, his jaw tightening as he wrestled with the words. For a moment, it seemed as though he might lash out again, but then his shoulders sagged and he lowered his head. Bryce stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. We'll face this together, he said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. But we have to stop now. No more running, no more hurting people. The tension in the room began to dissolve as Bryce's words sank in. Tyler, though still visibly shaken, gave a small, reluctant nod. Lila, who had been hovering protectively by Marcus's side, spoke up. "We need to call the police," she said firmly. "This is to end the right way." Bryce nodded, his expression somber. "Do it," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of his decision. As Lila picked up the phone, the patrons of the diner began to emerge from their hiding places, their expressions a mix of relief and lingering fear. Some of them moved to help Marcus, offering him napkins and cloths to stop the bleeding. Despite the pain, Marcus managed a small, reassuring smile. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice as steady as ever. Bryce and Tyler stood together, the weight of their actions pressing down on them like a physical force. But in that moment, something had shifted. The dynamic between them had changed. Bryce was no longer following Tyler's lead. Instead, he was guiding them both toward an uncertain but necessary reckoning. The sound of distant sirens began to fill the air, growing louder with each passing second. The turning point had arrived, and though the road ahead would be difficult, there was a sense that redemption was still within reach. The faint wail of approaching sirens filled the air, but inside the diner, the world seemed to pause. Marcus, sitting calmly despite the blood soaking through his sleeve, straightened in his chair. His voice, calm yet commanding, cut through the tension like a beacon in the storm. "Listen to me," he said, his tone firm but compassionate. His voice carried the weight of someone who had weathered countless storms and emerged stronger. "This doesn't have to end in more pain for any of us." Bryce looked at Marcus, his face etched with guilt. "I didn't want this," he said, his voice trembling. "I swear I didn't want anyone to get hurt." Marcus nodded slowly, his expression understanding. "I know you didn't, Bryce. I can hear it in your voice. You've made mistakes, but that doesn't mean you can't choose differently now." Tyler, standing stiffly a few feet away, glared at Marcus. "What do you know about mistakes?" he snapped, his voice laced with bitterness. "You think some fancy speech is going to fix everything?" Marcus turned his head slightly, his unseeing eyes seeming to pierce through the young man's defenses. "I know more about mistakes than you think," he replied evenly. "And I know what it feels like to believe there's no way out. But there always is. You just have to be willing to take it." The room was silent as Marcus continued, his words directed at both men, but clearly striking a chord with Tyler. "I've seen hatred and fear ruin lives," he said. "I felt the sting of it myself, more times than I care to count. But I've also seen the power of change. It's not easy, but it's worth it." Tyler's jaw tightened, his eyes darting to Bryce, who stood quietly, his gaze fixed on the floor. "You don't know anything about me," Tyler said, though his voice lacked the fire it had carried earlier. "You're right," Marcus admitted. "I don't know your whole story, but I can hear the pain in your voice, Tyler. And I know that pain can make us do things we never thought we'd do. But it doesn't have to define you." Bryce took a step forward, his voice hesitant but steady. "He's right, Tyler," he said. "We don't have to keep going like this. We can stop." "Stop!" Tyler's laugh was sharp and hollow. "You think the cops are just going to pat us on the back and let us go?" Marcus shook his head. "No, they won't. There are consequences for what you've done. But facing those consequences is the first step to making things right. Running or fighting won't fix anything. It'll only make things worse." Tyler's shoulders sagged, and for a moment, he looked like a lost child. "You don't get it," he said quietly. "I can't go back. I've already messed up too much. You can't undo what's been done," Marcus said gently. "But you can choose what comes next. You've got a chance to do something different, to be someone different. Don't waste it." The weight of Marcus's words hung in the air, pressing down on everyone in the room. Tyler's face twisted with emotion, his inner conflict playing out in every flicker of his expression. Bryce stepped closer to him, his hand outstretched. "We'll do it together," he said. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. I'm not leaving you." Tyler looked at Bryce, his eyes glassy with unshed tears. Slowly, he nodded, the fight draining out of him. Marcus leaned forward, his voice quiet but resolute. "The police are almost here," he said. "When they come in, keep your hands visible and don't resist. Show them you're ready to make amends." Both young men nodded, their postures stiff with tension but no longer hostile. The sirens grew louder, and the faint red and blue glow of lights began to filter through the diner's windows. Despite his injury, Marcus managed a small, reassuring smile. "It's not too late," he said, his words carrying a quiet strength. "This is just the beginning of your story. Make it one worth telling." The siren stopped, and the sound of car doors opening and boots on pavement filled the air. As the police entered, Marcus's calm guidance lingered like a lifeline, holding the fragile piece together. The diner was bathed in the red and blue glow of police lights, their relentless flash casting long shadows on the walls. The faint echo of officers calling out commands outside added to the tense atmosphere inside. Every eye in the room was fixed on Bryce and Tyler, whose faces were pale and strained as they stood frozen in place. "All right," Bryce whispered, his voice barely audible over the rising tension. "This is it." Tyler clenched his fists, his breathing shallow and rapid. His gaze darted between the door and the emergency exit in the back. "We should run," he hissed. "We still have a chance." "You know that's not true," Marcus interjected calmly. Despite the throbbing pain in his arm, his voice remained steady. "Running won't solve anything, Tyler. It'll only make things worse." Bryce turned to Tyler, desperation etched into his features. "He's right. If we run now, we'll be looking over our shoulders for the rest of our lives. This has to end here." "It's easy for you to say," Tyler snapped, his voice cracking with the weight of his emotions. "You don't get it. I can't just stand here and wait to be locked up like some animal." "No one's saying it's going to be easy," Marcus said, his tone softening as he addressed Tyler's fear. "But facing the consequences is the only way to move forward. You can't outrun this, Tyler. Not the law and not yourself." Tyler's shoulders trembled as he struggled with the decision. His mind raced, filled with memories of every hardship he'd endured, every mistake he'd made, and every moment that had brought him to this point. Bryce stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I'm not leaving you," he said firmly. "No matter what happens, we're in this together. But we can't keep running, Tyler. This has to stop." Tyler's face crumpled, a mix of anger, fear, and something else. Hope breaking through his hardened exterior. "You think they'll forgive us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "They might not," Marcus admitted, his unseeing eyes fixed on where Tyler stood. "But forgiveness starts with you. It starts with taking responsibility for your actions and showing the world that you're willing to change." The tension in the room was palpable as the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. The police were at the door now, their voices calling out for everyone to stay calm and exit with their hands visible. Tyler looked at Bryce, his eyes searching for reassurance. Bryce nodded, his own fear evident but overshadowed by his determination. "We'll face it together," Bryce said, his voice resolute. With a deep, shaky breath, Tyler nodded. Slowly, both young men raised their hands, signaling their surrender. The sight of their submission sent a wave of relief through the diner, though the tension remained thick in the air. The door swung open, and officers entered cautiously, their weapons drawn but lowered as they took in the scene. Marcus spoke up, his calm voice cutting through the chaos. "Officers, these two are unarmed and willing to cooperate. Please handle this with care." The lead officer nodded, motioning for Bryce and Tyler to step forward. Both complied, their hands still raised as they walked toward the police. Lila clutched Marcus's uninjured arm, tears streaming down her face as she watched the scene unfold. "Do you think they'll be okay?" she whispered. "They've taken the first step," Marcus replied, his voice filled with quiet hope. "Now it's up to them to keep walking the right path." As Bryce and Tyler were led out of the diner, their expressions a mix of fear and relief. The patrons slowly began to emerge from their hiding spots. Some murmured words of gratitude to Marcus, Others simply looked on in silence, processing the events of the night. The intensity of the moment lingered, but there was a sense that the storm had passed. Marcus, despite his injury, sat with a quiet dignity, his presence a calming force in the aftermath of the chaos. Outside, the sound of car doors closing signaled the departure of Bryce and Tyler, their journey toward redemption just beginning. The suspense gave way to a fragile hope, the resolution still uncertain but no longer out of reach. The diner had fallen eerily quiet after Bryce and Tyler were escorted outside. The harsh glow of the police car lights illuminated the two young men as they stood together, their hands cuffed, but their postures no longer tense with defiance. Inside the diner, Marcus sat at the counter, a paramedic tending to the graze on his arm. Despite the pain, his focus remained on the unfolding events outside. As the officers prepared to load Bryce and Tyler into separate vehicles, Bryce turned to one of them. "Wait," he said, his voice firm but respectful. "I need to say something before we go." The officer hesitated but gave a brief nod, stepping aside as Bryce turned back toward the diner. His eyes searched for Marcus and Lila through the window, and when he found them, his voice faltered. I'm sorry," he said, his words carrying through the open door. Inside, Lila froze, her tear-streaked face softening as she heard Bryce's apology. Marcus, still seated with the paramedic wrapping his arm, tilted his head slightly, listening intently. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," Bryce continued, his voice trembling. "I thought I didn't have a choice, but I see now that I was wrong. Marcus, you could have stayed quiet, but instead, you tried to help us. I don't deserve your kindness, but thank you." Lila stepped closer to the window, her hand pressed against the glass. "We all make mistakes," she said, her voice gentle but strong. "What matters is what you do next." Bryce nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "I'll make it right," he said, his voice breaking. "I promise." Tyler, standing a few feet away, watched the exchange with a mix of emotions. His usual scowl was gone, replaced by something raw and unguarded. For a moment, it seemed as though he wouldn't say anything, but then he spoke, his tone quieter, almost uncertain. "Marcus," Tyler began, struggling to meet the older man's gaze. "I don't know why you said the things you did, or why you tried to help someone like me, but I don't think I'll forget it." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his unseeing eyes turned in Tyler's direction. "Because I believe you're capable of more," he said simply. "You've made bad choices, Tyler, but those choices don't have to define who you are. Only you can decide that." The weight of Marcus's words seemed to settle on Tyler's shoulders, and for the first time, he appeared truly vulnerable. He opened his mouth to speak again, but was interrupted as one of the officers gently urged him toward the car. As Bryce and Tyler were driven away, the tension in the air seemed to lift, leaving a quiet, reflective calm in its place. Lila turned to Marcus, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. "They heard you," she said softly. "I think you really got through to them." Marcus exhaled deeply, his usually calm demeanor showing a hint of weariness. "I hope so," he replied. "It's not easy to change, but maybe tonight was the start of something for them." The other patrons in the diner began to approach cautiously, expressing their gratitude and concern for Marcus. The sense of community, fractured by the robbery, seemed to mend itself in the shared relief and admiration for Marcus's courage. As the paramedics prepared to take Marcus to the hospital for further care, he turned to Lila. "Thank you for standing strong tonight," he said. "You're braver than you realize." Lila smiled faintly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I just followed your lead," she replied. As Marcus was helped into the ambulance, he took one last look, or what he imagined as a look, at the diner. It wasn't the same as it had been hours ago, but it was still standing, and so were the people in it. The emotional climax of the night had passed, but its impact lingered. The bonds forged in the chaos were stronger than the fear that had threatened to break them. And for Bryce and Tyler, Though their journey was far from over, they had taken their first steps toward redemption. The ambulance had departed, and the diner was slowly returning to a semblance of normalcy. Yet, the weight of what had transpired still lingered. Marcus's words, spoken with a rare blend of wisdom and compassion, had left a profound impact on everyone who had witnessed the events of the evening. Inside the diner, Lila stood with a group of patrons, recounting the moments of courage and calm that had defused a volatile situation. Though shaken, her voice carried an unmistakable strength. "Marcus said something I'll never forget," she began, her hands gripping a coffee cup for comfort. "He told Bryce and Tyler that our choices define us, that no matter how far we've strayed, it's never too late to turn around. I think that's true for all of us." Her words struck a chord, prompting nods and murmurs of agreement from those around her. The local police officers, who had remained to take statements, paused in their work to listen. One of the officers, Sergeant Collins, approached the group. His stern expression had softened since the earlier chaos. "She's right," he said, his voice firm but thoughtful. "I've been on this job for 20 years, and I've seen a lot of people make bad choices. But I've also seen people turn their lives around because someone gave them a chance. Tonight, Marcus did that for those two young men." A patron seated nearby, an older man named Frank, spoke up. "Marcus has always been that way," he said. "He doesn't just talk about doing the right thing. He lives it. He's been a pillar in this community for as long as I can remember." Lila smiled faintly, her thoughts returning to Marcus's calm demeanor, even as he faced danger. "He doesn't just see people for what they've done," she said, her voice soft. "He sees them for what they could be. And that's something we could all learn from." Inspired by Marcus's example, the conversation shifted to how the community could work together to prevent future incidents. Ideas flowed freely: neighborhood watch programs, mentoring for troubled youth, and increased support for local businesses and families. "We can't just sit back and wait for things to change," Lila said, her voice growing steadier with each word. "We have to be the change." Marcus proved tonight that one person can make a difference. "Imagine what we could do if we all worked together." Her words lit a spark among the diners. People who had once been passive observers of their community's struggles now felt a renewed sense of purpose. Even Sergeant Collins, who had seen his fair share of despair, felt a glimmer of hope. "We'll work with you," he said. "The police aren't just here to enforce the law. We're here to serve and protect. If we can help rebuild trust and create opportunities for people like Bryce and Tyler, then maybe we can stop these problems before they start." Outside, the first hints of dawn began to light the sky, casting a warm glow over the diner. The night's turmoil had given way to a sense of renewal, a feeling that change, however small, was possible. As the community dispersed, Lila took a moment to stand by the diner's window, watching the sun rise. She thought of Marcus and his quiet strength, his unwavering belief in the goodness of people. "Forgiveness," she murmured to herself. "Second chances. Kindness. That's what he taught us tonight." Though Marcus wasn't there to hear it, his words had planted seeds of hope and unity in the hearts of those he had touched. And in the days and weeks to come, those seeds would grow, transforming a community that had been on the brink of despair into one bound by a shared commitment to justice, compassion, and redemption. Weeks passed, and the community began to recover from the shock of the robbery. Though the scars of that night remained, they served as reminders of the courage, compassion, and resilience that had emerged in its wake. Bryce, having pled guilty, received a lighter sentence due to his cooperation and genuine remorse. Instead of being sent to a traditional prison, he was admitted to a rehabilitation program designed to help young offenders rebuild their lives. As part of his recovery, Bryce wrote letters to Marcus and Lila, expressing his gratitude and detailing his plans to make amends. One letter read, "Dear Marcus, I think about that night every day. You didn't have to speak to me the way you did, but you did anyway. You saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. I'm working hard to be someone you'd be proud of. Thank you for believing in me when I didn't deserve it. Sincerely, Bryce. Asterisk. Tyler's path was harder, initially resistant. He began therapy at the urging of his court-appointed counselor. Marcus's words lingered in his mind, a steady echo of the man who had shown him unexpected kindness. Over time, Tyler began to confront the anger and pain he'd buried for years. It was a slow process, but one that hinted at the possibility of real change. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood shifted in meaningful ways. Inspired by the events, the community came together to launch new initiatives. A mentorship program was established for at-risk youth, and local businesses partnered with schools to provide part-time jobs and training. The diner, once the site of fear, became a symbol of unity and renewal. Lila, who had found new strength in herself that night, became a leader in these efforts. She and Marcus grew closer, their bond strengthened by the shared experience of facing danger and inspiring change. Together, they worked to keep the spirit of hope alive, each in their own way. For Marcus, that meant returning to his piano. His work as a piano tuner had always been his way of connecting with others, but now his music took on new meaning. One evening, he invited the neighborhood to gather at the community center for a small concert. The room was filled with familiar faces, including Lila, Sergeant Collins, and even some of the officers who had responded that night. As Marcus sat at the piano, the room fell silent. His fingers moved across the keys with grace and purpose, weaving a melody that spoke of struggle, redemption, and hope. The notes seemed to carry the weight of everything the community had been through, yet they also held a promise of better days ahead. When the song ended, the room erupted in applause. Lila, standing at the edge of the crowd, wiped a tear from her cheek. She wasn't the only one. As the applause subsided, Marcus turned his unseeing eyes toward the audience, a faint smile on his lips. "Thank you for being here," he said. "Music has a way of healing wounds we can't always see. But healing isn't something we do alone. It's something we do together. That's what this community has shown me." The final shot panned out, capturing the warmth of the gathering, the smiles, the tears, the laughter. The piano's melody lingered in the air, a symbol of harmony and renewal. The camera settled on Marcus, his hands resting lightly on the keys. Though his world was dark, his spirit shone brightly, a beacon for those around him. The screen faded to black as his voice echoed one last time. It's never too late to choose kindness, to find hope, to start again. And with that, the story came to a close. Not an ending, but a beginning for everyone involved.